Late September 1944, on a fog-stained morning along the English coast, the first intact German V-2 rocket lay half buried in the shingle. It had fallen short of London, burying itself deep in the mud of a tidal flat, the warhead shattered but the engine section astonishingly intact. Royal engineers, more accustomed to defusing bombs than handling what looked like a spacecraft, ringed the crater with sandbags and silence. Every man there understood this was no ordinary weapon. It was the future, and it had arrived in a terrible, smoking arc. Within days, the wreck was transported under canvas and secrecy to a dockside warehouse at Tilbury. By the time it reached the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, it was being referred to not as the V-2 but as the device. Even in wartime bureaucracy, a new language was required for what the Germans had built. The casing, scorched bronze gray, was longer than a bus. British technicians stood beneath it in quiet disbelief. The V-2 wasn't simply an artillery shell enlarged to monstrous scale. It was an engineering category that had not yet been invented in the West. Dr. John Anderson, head of the captured enemy weapons division, had spent much of the war analyzing German radar and aircraft parts. He had seen clever machines, elegant designs, ruthless precision, but nothing like this. The rocket's body gleamed under the hangar lights, welded seams running its length like the hull of a submarine. Faded German script still clung to its skin. Vorlaufende Abnahme, Peenemünde, a clue to its birthplace and to a coastal laboratory that had eluded Allied bombers for 4 years. The engineers began by prying away the shattered guidance section. Inside were gyroscopes mounted on jewel bearings polished like watch mechanisms. One technician whispered, "They've built a clock that flies." In a sense, he was right. The guidance platform was a masterpiece of balance, a mechanical brain that could keep a 12-ton missile upright through 50 miles of airless sky. British aircraft still relied on pilot instinct. This machine relied on mathematics. As components were catalogued, Anderson felt an unease that no amount of patriotism could suppress. Each discovery, rather than diminishing the Germans, made their achievement seem greater. The turbines were compact, over-engineered, terrifyingly efficient. The fuel system used alcohol and liquid oxygen, propellant so volatile that even a misstep in temperature could turn the rocket into a torch. And yet, German engineers had made it function by the hundreds. Where the Allies built reliability from robustness, the Germans built it from precision balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The Air Ministry ordered a full scientific reconstruction. The fragments were dispatched to secret facilities at Waltham Abbey, Cardington, and Farnborough. Teams of chemists, metallurgists, and aerodynamicists converged. Some had designed Spitfires, others had studied jet engines. None had handled anything so alien. Blueprints were drawn from fragments, curvature measured with calipers. The rocket's shape, sleek, tapering to a knife-edge fin, seemed less engineered than evolved. At the top, a blunt cone designed to survive re-entry at supersonic speed. At the base, a bell-shaped nozzle that spoke of laboratory experiments far beyond anything the Allies had attempted. In November, a delegation from the Ministry of Supply arrived. Among them was Sir Alwyn Crowe, Britain's pioneer in rocketry who had worked on solid fuel boosters before the war but found his research starved of funds. He circled the V-2's combustion chamber like a man at an altar. "This," he murmured, "is what we would have built, if only we had believed." The line hung in the air. For years, Allied intelligence had dismissed reports of long-range rockets as fantasy, the fever dreams of German propaganda. Now the wreckage under their hands was undeniable proof that imagination, when coupled with relentless engineering, had turned fantasy into artillery. Anderson's diary that week reads like confession more than report. "Every bolt speaks of resources we have not commanded," he wrote. "Their factories may now be in ruins, yet this machine tells us that 4 years ago they were already decades ahead." He was not alone in his awe. At Peenemünde, the Germans had gathered physicists, chemists, and aeronautical engineers into one integrated design bureau, a concept no British ministry had managed. The result was industrialized science. The Allies had compartmentalized brilliance. The Germans had organized it. When the V-2 was hoisted onto a test stand at Cardington in early 1945, technicians treated it like a volatile animal. Pipes hissed, metal ticked as it cooled. The fuel lines still smelled of ethanol and kerosene. A young engineer, Peter Mawson, recorded in his log that even in its silence the rocket felt alive, like something waiting for orders. They ran the first electrical tests with trembling hands, feeding current into the guidance circuits. The gyros began to spin with a sound like distant bees. The machine seemed to remember. The data gathered from that stand test traveled straight to the highest circles of command. Churchill himself received a summary noting that Germany had created a weapon capable of striking from 200 miles away at Mach 4, beyond the reach of any interceptor. The Prime Minister, reading by lamplight, underlined a single sentence in red: "No known defense." He closed the folder and told his aide, "It is fortunate for civilization that they are losing." The British scientific establishment felt both relief and humiliation. Relief that Germany could no longer exploit such power. Humiliation that the discovery had come not through foresight, but through wreckage. At Farnborough, Anderson and his team began to reconstruct the propulsion system piece by piece. They tested fuel injector plates drilled with hundreds of microscopic holes, each angled to create a swirl that atomized the propellant perfectly. Their own injectors for jet engines looked primitive beside it. One chemist remarked, "They've built the mathematics of combustion into metal." No one answered. When the Allies captured Peenemünde itself in May 1945, the pieces of the puzzle finally connected. Blueprints matched the fragments on Anderson's tables. Photos showed assembly halls the size of cathedrals. There, German engineers had produced rockets in sequences as methodical as car manufacturing. A Ford line for the apocalypse. The British scientists who walked through those halls found notes scribbled in grease pencil on the walls. Equations, trajectories, pressure curves. They realized the V-2 had been not a prototype, but a product. For every rocket that reached London, dozens more waited on assembly jigs. By summer's end, captured V-2s were being shipped across the Atlantic under Operation Backfire and Operation Paperclip, bound for the United States. Anderson watched the first one leave Southampton docks, its fins protruding from the ship's hold like the bones of a whale. He wrote one last memo. "We began this war chasing the enemy's aircraft. We end it chasing their ideas." What none of them yet knew was that the V-2 would not end with victory celebrations. It would seed two empires of the Cold War. The Americans would study its design at White Sands Proving Ground, firing captured rockets into the desert sky. The Soviets, seizing their share from occupied Germany, would launch their own from Kapustin Yar. From the wreckage at Farnborough and the ruins at Peenemünde, two rival dreams of space would rise. Yet for Anderson and his weary team, the immediate feeling was not triumph, but vertigo. They had looked into the heart of an enemy weapon and glimpsed the architecture of the future. In that gleaming steel cylinder lay both the promise of spaceflight and the shadow of annihilation. And the question lingered like the smell of burnt alcohol in the hangar. How had the world's most methodical democracy fallen so far behind a nation in ruins? The answer, Anderson concluded, was not intelligence or imagination. It was belief. The Germans had believed in the impossible and built toward it. The Allies had believed only in what seemed practical. The war had been decided by industry, but the future would be decided by audacity. He closed his notebook and switched off the lights. The hangar fell silent except for the slow tick of cooling metal, the echo of a technology that would soon escape the gravity of war itself. The months that followed Peenemunde's capture turned the remnants of Germany's most secret project into a mosaic of competing nations and ambitions. What had once been the Reich's most guarded technology was now divided like treasure between the victors. For the British scientists at Farnborough, the work continued under a veil of fatigue and fascination. Every new test they conducted on the V-2 fragments seemed to deepen the paradox. Germany had lost the war, yet it had built the most advanced machine on Earth. The reconstruction effort became a kind of forensic archaeology of genius. Engineers in oil-stained lab coats laid out fragments on long tables under arc lamps, aligning each curved section until a shape emerged, a body of steel that pointed toward the heavens. The missile's skin was composed of thin welded plates, their seams so perfect that even under magnification they showed no distortion. Britain's own metalwork, often the product of wartime expedients, looked crude beside it. One inspector wrote, "We have met a civilization of machines." They discovered that the rocket's structural framework was designed with weight reduction in mind, each rib calculated to bear maximum stress with minimum material. German engineers had treated every kilogram as sacred. British aircraft design had followed similar principles, but never at this microscopic level. Even the screws were hollowed to save mass. Each discovery felt like an indictment, not only of British engineering but of its cautious imagination. One winter morning, as snow drifted through the cracked skylights of the hangar, Anderson gathered his senior team. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "what we are looking at is not merely a weapon. It is the first industrial organism built to leave the Earth." The phrase startled them. Yet no one disagreed. The data pouring in from captured documents confirmed it. The V-2 had a thrust of nearly 60,000 pounds. It reached an altitude of 50 miles before arcing down at supersonic speed. For a brief moment, every missile became the first man-made object in space. The idea was both wondrous and horrifying, a glimpse of the stars born from an act of terror. By early 1945, Anderson's laboratory had transformed into a hybrid of science and espionage. American liaison officers from the newly formed Army Ordnance Section began arriving unannounced, always polite, always observing. They asked for test results, requested photographs, and quietly took notes. Everyone knew why they were there. The United States was already preparing to move the entire German rocketry team to its own soil. Britain, exhausted by 6 years of war and economic ruin, could not compete. In March, a new directive arrived from Whitehall. One of the captured V-2s was to be assembled in full working order and fired under British supervision. The code name was Operation Backfire. It would be the first Allied attempt to launch a German rocket, not as a weapon but as a test of comprehension. If it worked, it would prove they had finally learned to speak the language of the enemy's machines. The operation took place on the misty coast near Cuxhaven, in the ruins of a former Luftwaffe airfield now under British control. Teams from Farnborough and the Royal Artillery arrived in convoys of Bedford trucks bringing crates marked spare parts, though the locals whispered they carried ghost bombs. Anderson stood on the observation deck as German technicians, now working under Allied supervision, reassembled the rocket they had once built for Hitler. They worked with quiet precision, their faces expressionless, their hands sure. He found it impossible not to admire them. One of the German engineers, a thin man named Karl Heinemann, approached him with a set of diagrams drawn on yellowing paper. "The thrust vector control," Heinemann explained in halting English, You must warm the alcohol feed lines first, otherwise you get cavitation. Anderson nodded slowly. The man's tone was devoid of arrogance. It was the voice of a craftsman ensuring his creation would not be misunderstood. On the morning of the test, the launch pad was wreathed in frost. A cold wind blew in from the North Sea. The assembled officers, scientists, and soldiers stood behind a sandbagged observation bunker half a mile away. The countdown came over a field telephone, each number crisp and deliberate. At 0, the ignition sequence roared to life. A plume of orange fire expanded beneath the rocket, boiling the mist into a halo of light. Then, with a sound that defied comparison, the V-2 rose. It climbed cleanly, almost gracefully, trailing a white scar across the sky. Within seconds, it vanished into the clouds. Silence followed, not the silence of peace, but of revelation. Anderson felt his chest tighten. He realized he was watching the birth of a new era. Around him, the officers were shouting, half in celebration, half in disbelief. Heinemann simply stood with his hands clasped, eyes following the invisible path upward. Minutes later, the telemetry confirmed it. The rocket had reached an altitude of 60 miles before descending into the North Sea. The mission was a success. Operation Backfire had worked. The Allies had fired the enemy's thunderbolt and understood its language. That evening, Anderson walked alone along the beach near the launch site. The air still carried the acrid smell of burnt alcohol and oxygen. He kicked at a fragment of scorched metal lying in the sand and picked it up. The heat had twisted it into a ribbon, the ghost of a fin that once cut the stratosphere. He wondered if the Germans in their laboratories years before had felt the same mix of fear and exhilaration when they saw their creation take flight. In London, reports of the successful launch were met with restrained applause. Britain had demonstrated technical mastery, but the victory felt hollow. The scientists knew they were chronicling the end of their own primacy. Within weeks, American officers arrived to claim most of the remaining V-2s and the German experts who had built them. They were flown quietly to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands, New Mexico, where the desert skies would soon echo with new tests. Anderson protested, but Whitehall had no leverage. The war's debts were measured in billions, and every British laboratory ran on rationed electricity. America had the resources. Britain had the blueprints. It was an unequal partnership written in exhaustion. In the months that followed, British intelligence shared its reports with Washington. Combustion data, guidance schematics, metallurgical samples. In return, they received polite acknowledgments and fewer details with each passing week. The Americans had learned quickly, and they were already moving beyond the V-2, dreaming of rockets that could reach the other side of the world. Back at Farnborough, the hangars grew quieter. The teams dispersed. Some returned to aircraft work, others to universities. Anderson remained for a while, cataloging the last of the German parts. He labeled them in neat handwriting: nozzle section V-2. Guidance platform captured Peenemünde. To him, they were more than relics. They were fragments of a conversation between civilizations. One afternoon, as he was locking up the hangar, a young assistant asked him what he thought would become of the rocket technology now that the war was over. Anderson paused, then smiled faintly. "If mankind is wise," he said, "it will reach for the stars. If it is foolish, it will simply find a new way to destroy itself." The boy didn't answer. Neither did history, not yet. The winter of 1945 settled heavily over England. Bombed-out neighborhoods in London were still being cleared, and ration books ruled daily life. Yet inside the quiet laboratories at Farnborough, the scientists worked with a strange energy, as if they were glimpsing a horizon that no one else could see. The V-2 had changed them. It had stripped away any illusion that technology had limits. Anderson often found himself staring at the rocket's combustion chamber, still mounted on its support rig. The inner surface was lined with hundreds of copper cooling channels, each one carrying alcohol to prevent the walls from melting under the heat of its own fury. The geometry was beautiful in a cruel way. It was as though someone had taken the logic of an organ pipe and taught it how to explode. The Ministry of Supply had already decided that Britain would not continue large-scale rocket research. The war debt was too crushing. The empire itself was coming apart. What funding remained went to guided missiles and jet aircraft, projects that felt practical, safe, close to the ground. Anderson disagreed quietly. "The next battlefield will be measured in miles above the clouds," he warned in one memorandum. Few listened. Britain had fought one exhausting war. It had no appetite for another, even one fought in the sky. Still, Anderson refused to let the knowledge fade. He compiled a 400-page dossier titled Technical Lessons from German Rocket Development, blending scientific diagrams with philosophical commentary. In the opening line, he wrote, "The enemy's weapon was not only a device of war, it was a demonstration of what organized imagination can accomplish." Copies of his report circulated through ministries, universities, and eventually across the Atlantic, where American engineers studying under Wernher von Braun would quietly cite it in their early experiments. Across Europe, the ruins of Peenemünde were being dismantled brick by brick. The Soviets had arrived first, stripping machinery and shipping it east to their own test site at Kapustin Yar. Among the crates were fragments identical to those still lying on Anderson's workbench. Turbo pumps, gyroscopes, injector plates. When the first Soviet R-1 rocket rose from the steps in 1948, its engines still carried the same design DNA as the V-2. The weapon that had once terrorized London now reappeared under a red star, pointed toward the same sky but guided by a different ideology. Anderson followed these developments in the newspapers with an emotion that was half pride, half dread. The race he had foreseen was beginning. In his private notebook, he wrote, "They have taken the seed from the ruins, and now they will plant it on both sides of the world." He was right. By 1950, Britain's own efforts to replicate the V-2 had been quietly shelved. The final remnants of Operation Backfire were archived in classified vaults. Some of the scientists who had worked under Anderson emigrated to the United States, drawn by funding and the promise of open skies. Others remained, teaching new generations about aerodynamics and control systems, their lectures haunted by the ghost of that first German rocket. One evening years later, Anderson visited a lecture at Imperial College London. The topic was orbital mechanics and the future of spaceflight. The lecturer, a young physicist who had never seen war, spoke with excitement about satellites, weather prediction, and communication relays circling the Earth. Anderson listened from the back row, invisible among the students. When the slides changed to a photo of a V-2 standing upright on its launch pad at Peenemünde, the audience gasped softly. To them it looked primitive, a relic from a darker time. Anderson saw it differently. To him it was the moment everything had begun. After the lecture, he walked out into the drizzle along Exhibition Road. London was bright again, neon lights flickering where blackout curtains had once hung. Above the clouds, aircraft from Heathrow droned eastward, leaving trails of light across the night. He wondered how many of those contrails would someday be replaced by rockets, by vehicles that would not return. The thought filled him with both hope and fear. He paused outside the Science Museum, where through the glass he could see a small display of wartime relics, radar sets, an Enigma machine, fragments of an old Messerschmitt. One day, he knew, a V-2 would stand there too, polished, labeled, stripped of its terror. People would gaze at it and marvel, not at the destruction it caused, but at the audacity it represented. Anderson's health began to decline in the early 1950s. The stress of the war years, the constant exposure to chemicals and fuel vapors had taken its toll. Yet even in retirement, he continued to correspond with younger engineers. In one of his final letters, he wrote, "Remember that progress has two fathers, curiosity and fear. The danger lies when we mistake one for the other." In 1957, when news broke that the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, the world changed overnight, the newspapers filled with awe and alarm. In London, Anderson, now an old man with trembling hands, unfolded the Times and read the headline, "Russia launches satellite into orbit." Beneath the print was a small photograph of a silver sphere against the stars. He smiled faintly. The sound that once echoed over Cuxhaven's coast was now echoing in the vacuum of space. Humanity had followed the path first drawn by Peenemunde's engineers, by his own hands sifting through wreckage in a cold English hangar 13 years earlier. He realized that the war had not ended. It had simply changed altitude. The V-2 had killed thousands, but it had also forced mankind to confront its own potential. Every launch since, every capsule, every booster, every mission to orbit owed a silent debt to that brutal beginning. The line between weapon and wonder had always been thin, and it had first been etched in German steel. Anderson died quietly in 1959, his notebook sealed in a government archive. When historians opened them decades later, they found one final entry written in his careful hand. "We believed we were studying the enemy's machines. In truth, we were studying ourselves, our hunger to go farther, faster, higher, even when we do not yet understand why." Today, one of the captured V-2s stands in a museum in London, its fins reaching toward the ceiling, its paint restored, its menace forgotten. Visitors walk beneath it without realizing that every satellite orbiting above them, every rocket aimed at the stars, carries its shadow. The scientists who once gathered around that first wreck in the mud could not have known that they were standing at the threshold of a new epoch. They had sought to understand a weapon, and instead uncovered the blueprint for humanity's escape from gravity. In the silence of that discovery lay both salvation and ruin. The war had ended with cities in ashes, but the knowledge it unleashed would never be buried again. From Peenemünde to Farnborough, from White Sands to Cape Canaveral, from the North Sea to the moonlit vacuum beyond the earth, the same fire continued to burn. The fire that began when a captured rocket was lifted from the mud of an English shore, and men looked at it not with hatred, but with awe,